If you've ever walked along a marshy area at low tide, you know these places seem to have a rhythm of their own. You can smell the salty mud. You can see the tangled roots rising out of the water like a maze. The tide rolls in and it covers everything, only to retreat a few hours later and reveal a landscape once again. Years ago, as part of my own research, I spent time studying estuaries in the Northeast United States, and it taught me something important. These coastal environments aren't just places where land and water meet. They're also places where enormous amounts of carbon can be stored, buried, and locked away for centuries. For years, scientists have viewed tropical mangrove forests as one of nature's most effective tools for pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and locking it away in coastal soils. But what happens when the ocean itself begins to rise faster than those forests can adapt? Today we're going to explain why mangroves are such powerful carbon reservoirs, what new research is revealing about their future, and why rising seas may be creating an unexpected challenge for some of the planet's most valuable coastal ecosystems. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Dr. Mack, and this is the Climate Translation. Like all plants, mangroves pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis. They use that carbon to produce leaves, branches, trunks, and roots. At first glance, it doesn't sound very different than any other forests. But mangroves have a unique advantage. They live with their feet in salt water. Years ago, while conducting research in the Neponset Estuary in Boston, I spent a lot of time thinking about how coastal wetlands function. One of the things that makes these environments so fascinating is the fact they don't just store carbon in the plants themselves. They store enormous amounts of carbon beneath the surface. And that's where the story gets really interesting. Imagine a leaf falling from a tree in a typical inland forest. It lands in the ground. Bacteria and fungi begin to break it down. There, oxygen is plentiful. So, over time, much of the carbon is released back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Now, imagine that same leaf falling into a mangrove forest along the coast. Instead of landing on dry ground, it settles into waterlogged mud. And in that mud, oxygen is extremely limited. I often explain this to my students using a food preservation analogy. You can think of the sediment beneath those coastal mangrove forests like a giant natural vacuum-sealed bag. Without much oxygen available, the microbes responsible for decomposition can't work nearly as well, and thus the breakdown process slows dramatically. Instead of quickly returning to the atmosphere, leaves, roots, and other organic material become buried in the sediment. And so year after year and century after century, layer after layer, they build. This is what scientists call blue carbon. It refers to the watery ocean environment where this sequestration takes place. And as you can tell, it involves a process many people don't realize. The carbon isn't stored in the trees. It's stored in the soil beneath them. Over hundreds, even thousands of years, these coastal ecosystems can build enormous underground carbon reservoirs. In some cases, mangrove wetlands can store several times more carbon per acre than many terrestrial forests. That's one reason conservation groups and climate scientists have become so interested in protecting and restoring them. The idea seems straightforward. If you protect the mangroves, you protect the carbon vault. But that vault depends on a delicate balance of biology, geography, and sea level. Mangroves aren't fully aquatic plants. They still need access to oxygen, Many species have specialized roots that protrude above the mudline like snorkels, allowing them to breathe when the tide is low. As long as the forest can keep pace with changing conditions, the system works well. But if rising seas begin to outpace the forest's ability to adapt, the balance can start to break down. And that is where new research begins. Now, at this point, it will be easy to assume that mangroves are simply victims waiting for rising seas to overwhelm them. But it's not really the case. In fact, mangroves are remarkably resilient ecosystems. They have survived changing coastlines, shifting sediments, storms, and natural sea level fluctuations for thousands of years. And the reason they have survived so long is that they possess two natural ways of adapting to rising water. The first strategy is simple. They just build upward. Remember those tangled root systems we talked about earlier? The roots don't just anchor the trees, they act like giant sediment traps. As tide moves in and out, they carry tiny particles of mud, sand, and organic material, and the roots slow down that water and capture some of that sediment. Over time, the sediment accumulates, and the floor of the mangrove forest slowly rises. I sometimes tell students that you can imagine standing on an escalator that's moving downward. As long as you continue to climb upward at the same speed, you stay at the same place. For thousands of years, many mangrove forests have effectively been climbing that escalator. As the sea level rose slowly, forests built themselves upward. But mangroves have a second strategy as well. They can move. Many mangrove species produce floating propagules, essentially young seedlings that can drift with the tides before taking root elsewhere. If conditions become unfavorable near the shoreline, new mangroves can establish themselves farther inland, where elevations are slightly higher. In other words, mangrove forests don't stay in one place. Over long periods of time, entire forests can slowly migrate landward as coastlines shift. And historically, these two strategies worked pretty well. They built upward, they moved inland. Problem solved. But new research suggests human activity is creating what we might think of as a double stress on the system. The first stress involves the speed of sea level rise itself. As glaciers melt and ocean water expands due to warming temperatures, global sea levels are rising faster than they did through much of the recent past. That's where that escalator analogy becomes useful again. Imagine the escalator suddenly moving faster. You can still climb, but eventually there comes a point where you may not be able to climb quickly enough to keep up. That's the concern scientists are investigating. Not whether sea levels are rising, but whether sea levels are rising faster than some mangrove ecosystems can build the new sediment beneath themselves. If the water deepens too quickly, those specialized root structures we discussed earlier remain submerged for longer periods of time. The trees become stressed and growth slows. And in some cases, portions of the forest may begin to die back. But let's assume the forest tries that second strategy. They try to migrate inward. Historically, that worked. Today, it often doesn't. This is what scientists call the coastal squeeze. Over the last century, humans have transformed coastlines around the world. We've built roads and seawalls, hotels and ports, shrimp farms and neighborhoods, entire cities. When sea level rises and mangroves attempt to move inland, they increasingly encounter something that previous generations of mangroves never faced: us. Instead of finding open land, they encounter infrastructure. Their migration pathway has disappeared. The forest becomes trapped between the rising ocean on one side and human development on the other. That's the squeeze. And this is where the problem becomes particularly interesting from a systems perspective. The same coastlines we're trying to protect from rising seas are often the very coastlines preventing mangroves from adapting to those rising seas. The natural escape route is blocked. And when an ecosystem loses both of its adaptation strategies, the ability to move upward and inward, the risk begins to change. Now we're not talking about how mangroves store carbon. We're starting to ask what happens when that storage system starts to fail. That brings us to a central question that's raised by a recent research study at the University of Exeter. To answer that question, we need to return to the sediment beneath the mangrove forest. For centuries, those waterlogged soils have acted as an enormous storage reservoir. Layer after layer of organic material accumulated in an environment where decomposition was slowed by the lack of oxygen. But that storage system depends on the forest remaining intact. The trees aren't just storing carbon, they're protecting the very sediments that contain it. Their roots stabilize shorelines, they slow water movement, they trap sediment, and they maintain the physical structure of the ecosystem. When portions of a mangrove forest die, some of that protection begins to disappear. Roots can decay and shorelines become more vulnerable to erosion. The stored sediments become disturbed, redistributed, or exposed to new environmental conditions. And this is where scientists are becoming concerned. Remember that vacuum-sealed bag analogy from earlier? The reason carbon remains stored for so long is that oxygen is limited. But if erosion exposes those buried sediments to more oxygen, microbes can then begin to break down all of that stored organic material much more quickly. Over time, part of that carbon may return to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. In some situations, even methane can be involved, depending on the conditions within the sediment. Now, it's important to stop at this point because this is where the headlines can sometimes get ahead of the science. That Exeter research is not suggesting that all mangrove forests are going to suddenly become carbon sources. Nor are the scientists suggesting that centuries of stored carbon is going to be released overnight. But what they are identifying is a risk. It's a risk that some mangrove ecosystems may lose part of their ability to store carbon if sea level rise outpaces their ability to adapt. And the evidence is suggesting the risk is not distributed evenly. Some mangrove forests continue to perform remarkably well. In regions with abundant sediment supplied by rivers, they can build elevation fast enough to keep pace with rising water. In those with areas with room to migrate inland, they can remain resilient for decades. But other locations face greater challenges. That's particularly true for those experiencing rapid sea level rise, reduced sediment supply, and/or extensive coastal development. This is one reason scientists are increasingly viewing mangroves not as isolated forest, but as a dynamic system that's connected to our rivers, our coastlines, the tides, and our human infrastructure. It also introduces a feedback loop. It should sound familiar if you've listened to previous episodes. The more greenhouse gas we add to the atmosphere, the warmer the climate becomes. A warmer climate contributes to rising sea levels. Rising sea levels place additional stress on coastal ecosystems. And if some of those ecosystems become less effective at storing carbon, a portion of the natural buffering capacity we depend on begins to weaken. You notice what's happening there? The concern isn't that the mangroves are suddenly becoming the villains in the climate story. The concern is that one of nature's most effective carbon storage systems may become less effective under increasing stress. It's a reminder that climate change is not simply changing temperatures, it's changing the entire system and how it functions. So what does this leave our understanding of conservation? It's an interesting thing to think about. For a long time, conservation was largely built around a simple idea. You find something valuable, you draw a boundary around it, and you protect it. For many environmental challenges, the approach works pretty well. If you want to protect a forest, you establish a preserve. If you want to protect a wetland, you limit development. The goal is to keep the ecosystem exactly where it is. But the mangrove story highlights a new challenge. What happens when the ecosystem has to move? Remember, mangroves have never been completely static. Throughout history, they've responded to changing coastlines by building upward and gradually migrating inland. Movement has always been part of their survival strategy. The difference today is that human infrastructure increasingly limits that movement. And that's forcing scientists and conservation planners to rethink what success looks like. Instead of protecting a single location, we may need to protect the entire pathway. Instead of asking, how do we protect this forest where it is today, we may have to start to think, how do we preserve the ecosystem's ability to adapt tomorrow? That shift in thinking is already influencing how some coastal regions approach their restoration and management efforts. Scientists are increasingly looking beyond the boundaries of existing mangrove forest and evaluating the surrounding landscape. Is there room for migration? Is sediment still reaching the coast from nearby rivers? Are seawalls, roads, or development projects creating barriers that could eventually trap the ecosystem? In many cases, the long-term survival of a mangrove forest may depend on as much the land behind it as the water in front of it. And that brings us back to a theme that's appeared many times in this podcast. Natural systems don't operate in isolation. Those mangroves are connected to the rivers that supply sediment, and they're connected to the tides that shape the shoreline. They're connected to the atmosphere through the carbon they store, and increasingly, they're connected to the choices we make about how and where we build. The new research isn't telling us that mangroves have stopped being valuable carbon sinks. Far from it. If anything, it reinforces how valuable they really are. What it tells us is that protecting a carbon vault requires more than protecting the vault itself. It requires protecting the conditions that allow the vault to exist in the first place. For a long time, we tended to think of our forest and wetlands as carbon sinks and permanent fixtures on the landscape. And to a large extent, they still are. But what this emerging research is reminding us is that these ecosystems are not static. They're living systems constantly responding to changes in water, sediment, temperature, and sea level. The story of the mangroves isn't about the trees. It's about the balance between land and ocean, sediment and erosion, and adaptation and change. For thousands of years, mangrove forests have maintained the balance well. They've built upward and inland and adjusted to changing coastlines. The question scientists are now asking is whether the pace of change is beginning to outstrip the ability of some of the systems to keep up. Protecting a carbon sink isn't simply about protecting the trees we see at the surface. It's about protecting the conditions that allow the ecosystem to survive, adapt, and continue doing the work we've come to depend on. And as we've discussed many times on this podcast, the climate system is not a collection of separate pieces operating independently. The atmosphere, the oceans, the land, and the living ecosystem are all connected. And when one part of the system changes, the effect ripples outward in ways that are sometimes surprising. I'm Dr. Mack, and this has been The Climate Translation. If you have a question about the climate you've been too afraid to ask, or if you have a differing opinion, I want to hear from you. I can use your viewpoints in future episodes. You can reach me at theclimatetranslation@gmail.com. I'll see you next time.